All right, so as the January 6th committee hearings are still ongoing, and we are basically waiting to figure out whether or not any of the exposed criminality is actually going to result in charges for Donald Trump or his various lackeys who attempted to overturn the 2020 election. In the background, we have our right-wing reactionary Supreme Court that is effectively setting up the playbook for Republicans to do what Donald Trump tried to do in 2020 illegally, setting it up so that they will be able to do exactly what he tried to do in a legal way in 2024. So basically, this is all centering around this independent state legislature theory, which I'm going to read to you about from this Brennan Center breakdown. But then we're going to get into a hypothetical description here from Tom Hartman on exactly what this would actually look like in practice. So here to start us off with a little bit of information on exactly what this potential case that they are going to be hearing in the next couple of months is actually going to entail. They start us off here saying the independent state legislature theory is a reading of the Constitution pushed in recent years by a small group of advocates that would give state legislatures wide authority to gerrymander electoral maps and pass voter suppression laws. It has even been used as political cover to try to overturn elections, which is really where a lot of this is going to be centered around. But they continue saying the Constitution delegates power to administer federal elections to the states subject to congressional override. And the reason why I highlighted this here, congressional override, is because this is basically the only chance that there's going to be in terms of preventing what we're describing right now from happening. You're not going to get help from the state legislatures. You're not going to get help from the courts. And so congressional override, passing big, bold reforms to our election systems is literally the only response that you could possibly have to this type of thing outside of like packing the Supreme Court, which it doesn't seem like Democrats have any intention of doing that. But nonetheless, they continue saying there is, however, a disagreement about how much power is delegated and to which state actors exactly. So they say there are two relevant clauses. One is the Elections Clause, which reads, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives at the federal level shall be described or prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations. Again, pointing to that potential solution that is on the table for Democrats to act on right now if they wanted to prevent this from happening. But we don't really seem to have any movement on that or a sense of urgency from the Democratic Party. But they continue saying the other is the Presidential Electors Clause, which reads, each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. And the dispute hinges on how to understand the word legislature. The long-running understanding that we've been working with is that it refers to each state's general lawmaking processes, including all the normal procedures and limitations. So if a state constitution subjects legislation to being blocked by a governor's veto or citizen referendum, election laws can be blocked via the same means, and state courts must ensure that laws for federal elections, like all laws, comply with their state constitutions. They're basically trying to get rid of this entire standard here, and they're saying proponents of the independent state legislature theory reject this traditional reading, insisting that these clauses give state legislatures exclusive and near absolute power to regulate federal elections. And the result, when it comes to federal elections, legislators would be free to violate the state constitution and state courts couldn't stop them. And they say extreme versions of this theory would block legislatures from delegating their authority to officials like governors, secretaries of state, or election commissioners who currently play an important role in administering elections. So basically, to summarize all of that, they're trying to make this even more politicized than it already is. They're trying to give essentially unilateral authority over to massively racially gerrymandered state legislatures, which have come to power over the last number of years, as Republicans have really been focusing on this state legislature approach and using gerrymandering to ensure their power, even if Democrats end up winning over 50% or in some cases over 60 to 65% of the vote, you will still end up with Republicans in control of these state legislatures. And this is the body, these state legislatures are who they want to give complete and total control from top to bottom in terms of how elections are run, what potential voter suppression laws are legal or illegal or able to be put in place. Again, it's going going to worsen gerrymandering, and most importantly, it would allow these state legislatures to basically just ignore the popular vote within federal elections, like the presidency, for example, and just send their own slate of electors based on what the state legislatures pick and choose instead of what the actual voters were trying to have done. So it obviously has far-reaching consequences, but a little bit more information here. They say, what would happen if the Supreme Court accepted this theory? They say the independent state legislature theory would cause significant disruption by potentially nullifying state constitutional provisions regarding federal elections. State constitutional bans on gerrymandering in Florida, Ohio, North Carolina, and other states could die, as could independent redistricting commissions in Arizona, California, Michigan, and other states. And other state constitutional provisions, like the right to a secret ballot in many states, could also be wiped out. They say delegations of authority would also be questioned, robbing elections commissions and secretaries of state of the power to make decisions, including in emergencies, and only federal courts would have the power to review gerrymandering or voter suppression claims relating to federal elections. And they say the nightmare scenario is that a legislature displeased with how an election official on the ground has interpreted her state's election laws could invoke the theory as a pretext to refuse to certify the results of a presidential election and instead select its own slate of electors. Indeed, this isn't far from the plan that Donald Trump attempted following his loss in the 2020 election. And according to former federal judge J. Michael Luddig, a distinguished conservative jurist, the theory is a part of the Republican blueprint to steal the 2024 election. So obviously, stakes are high on this. And again, we know basically the result that we're going to get from this Supreme Court. I would be massively surprised if they do not side. I think it's North Carolina that is actually bringing this case. I would be wildly surprised if they don't side with North Carolina and effectively allow these state legislatures to hijack the entirety of federal elections and again empower them to do exactly what Donald Trump tried to do in 2020, except this time they would have legal and constitutionally interpreted justification for doing that. So here from Thom Hartmann, he gives us a hypothetical breakdown in terms of how this would actually look, how it would play out, and what would be the response from a lot of these right-wing militias and conservative groups like the Proud Boys and the Patriot Front and the Oath Keepers, etc., in response to this potential situation. So it's a long thread here, but I just want to run through it with you guys because I do think that this is pretty important if you even give a shit about protecting the facade of democracy that we have left. We're basically talking about, you know, preventing or having a straight-up right-wing fascist takeover of the country and complete dismantling of any pretend democracy that we have left in this country. But he starts off here saying the nightmare scenario SCOTUS is plotting for the 2024 election takeover. 6 Republicans on the Supreme Court just announced a story that has largely flown under the nation's political radar that they will consider pre-rigging the presidential election of 2024. Here's how one aspect of it could work out if they go along with the GOP's arguments that will be before the court this October. He says it's November 2024 and the presidential race between Biden and DeSantis has been tabulated by the states and called by the networks. Biden won 84 million votes to DeSantis's 77 million votes, clearly carrying the popular vote. I think, again, this is very generous in terms of what would be realistic. I think that DeSantis would straight up defeat Biden, both in the popular vote and otherwise. But nonetheless, this is basically giving Democrats as gracious of a hypothetical situation as possible. And even under this extremely generous hypothetical that Thom Hartmann is laying out here for Democrats, still Joe Biden would not end up as the winner of this election. But they point out there the 84 million to 77 million. Obviously, we have the Electoral College, so the popular vote is not entirely relevant. And he says the popular vote isn't enough. George W. Bush lost to Al Gore by 500,000 votes. Trump lost to Hillary by 3 million votes. Both ended up in the White House. What matters is obviously the Electoral College. And again, we get back to the hypothetical. He says, as CNN is reporting, the outcome is a virtual clone of the 2020 election. Biden carries the same states that he did in 2020, and DeSantis gets all of the Trump states. So it's a 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, a 74-vote Electoral College lead for Biden, at least as calculated by CNN and the rest of the media, under how we currently calculate our Electoral College votes, and Biden is heading to the White House for another 4 years. And he continues saying, until the announcement comes out of Georgia. Although Biden won the popular vote in Georgia, their legislature decided it can overrule the popular vote and just awarded the state's 16 electoral votes to DeSantis instead of Biden. Keep in mind, Donald Trump literally called the Secretary of State here in Georgia. That was a phone call that was exposed where he was saying, can't you just find me 11,000 votes? I need 11,000 votes in order to overturn this this result. So again, this is exactly what Trump was trying to do. He was just doing it in a very sloppy mafia boss type of way, whereas this would basically be a Supreme Court granted or Supreme Court justified legal way of doing the exact same goddamn thing. But he continues saying, an hour later, we hear from 5 other states with Republican-controlled legislatures where Biden won the majority of the vote, just like he had in 2020. You could say North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Arizona, and each has followed Georgia's lead, and their legislatures have awarded their electoral college votes, even though Biden won the popular vote, to DeSantis, and thus a total of 88 electoral college votes from those 6 states move from Biden to DeSantis, who is then declared the winner and will be sworn in on January 20th, 2025. Wolf Blitzer announces that DeSantis has won the election, and millions of people pour out into the streets in protest. They're met with a hail of bullets as Republican-affiliated militias have been rehearsing for this exact moment. I do not think, and I don't think that you guys should think for even a split second that this is a stretch, that this is something that is unrealistic. I think this could absolutely happen, and I'm basically just basing that off of the fact that we know that the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Patriot Front guys, even though they are complete losers, and we understand that they seem like they're LARPing to a large extent, they are waiting for this moment, and whether or not you think that they're LARPing, if it came down to it, they would be going out into the streets and they would be ready and willing to use violence. So I don't think that this is a stretch by any means here. But he continues saying, just as happened when Pinochet's militias shot into crowds as he took over Chile, when Mussolini's volunteer militia, the black shirts, killed civilians as he took over Italy, and Hitler's brown shirts did the same in Germany, their allies among the police and army would refuse to intervene. I don't think anybody who understands how the U.S. police force operate would be surprised to learn that they would stand by and allow this type of thing to happen. If anything, I think that they would probably join in with a lot of these right-wing militias. Many police are literally a part of a lot of these militias. But he continues saying, after a few thousand people lay dead in the streets of 24 cities, the police began to round up the surviving instigators, who are then charged with seditious conspiracy for resisting the Republican legislatures of their states. And after he's sworn in on January 20th, President DeSantis points to the ongoing demonstrations, declares a permanent state of emergency, and suspends future elections, just as Trump had repeatedly told the world that he planned for 2020. Sound far-fetched? 6 Republicans on the Supreme Court just announced that one of the first cases that they will hear next year could include whether that very scenario is constitutional or not, and it almost certainly is. And he says Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution lays out the process clearly, and it doesn't even once mention the popular vote or the will of the people. It says each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled to Congress. The electors shall meet with their respective states and vote by ballot for 2 persons, which list they shall sign and certify and transmit the sealed to the seat of the government of the United States, directed to the President of the Senate. And the President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and the House of Representatives, open all the certificates and count the votes, basically. And he says it's not particularly ambiguous, even as clarified by the 12th Amendment and the Electoral Count Act of 1887. Neither mentions the will of the people, although the Electoral Count Act requires each state's governor to certify the vote before passing it along to D.C., and half of those states have Democratic governors, so tiny glimmer of hope there, but really not much to hang your hat on. But he continues saying, which brings us to the Supreme Court's probable 2023 decision. As Robert Barnes wrote yesterday for the Washington Post, the Supreme Court on Thursday said it will consider what would be a radical change in the way federal elections are conducted, giving state legislatures the sole authority to set the rules for contests, even if their actions violated the state constitutions and resulted in extreme partisan gerrymandering for congressional seats. And while the main issue is being debated in Moore v. Harper, scheduled for a hearing this October, is a gerrymander that conflicts with North Carolina's own constitution, the issue at the core of the debate is what's called the independent state legislature doctrine, which we just outlined right there. So again, you see exactly what the playbook is here. They're basically trying to make it constitutional. They are trying to legalize exactly what Donald Trump was trying to get Mike Pence to do. The whole plan was initially he wanted to claim fraud and have a lot of these states like Georgia, Arizona, North Carolina, the rest of the ones that Biden won by relatively slim margins. He basically wanted them to put forward a different slate of electors than what was previously put forward according to the popular vote and according to the will of the people. And so that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to send Mike Pence as the president of the Senate during that instance on January 6th, when his own supporters were going out there and chanting to hang Mike Pence. Basically, his job was to take in the electoral votes and count them. It was basically just a superficial procedure that was going on. But the key part of that is he's just going to get up there and count whichever slate of electors is given to him. And if these state legislatures are legally and constitutionally allowed by the Supreme Court to just give them whatever the fuck slate of electors they want based on their partisan choices that they're making, regardless of what the popular vote within their state says, then they could just hand them those electors, and those would be the ones that end up getting counted in the Electoral College, which again could basically make it so that you have an exact repeat of the 2020 election results, which again, granted, is being very, very generous to the Democratic Party, but you could have Biden in 2024, or whoever the Democratic candidate is, win all of the states that Biden won in 2020, Georgia, Arizona, North Carolina, all these other states that he managed to pull off. And you could still have a situation where Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump become the elected president of the United States just based on this completely delusional minority rule independent state legislature theory. So again, in terms of protecting the facade of democracy that we have left in this country, this is pretty much as dire as it gets. I mean, we can talk about all of the other Supreme Court rulings that we've had over the last couple of weeks that are undermining democracy, that are giving more unchecked power over to the capitalist class in this country, that are allowing for the destruction of the environment with the West Virginia versus EPA, with the abortion ruling, which is stripping Americans of some of their fundamental rights, the Fourth Amendment ruling regarding Border Patrol agents. We could go through so many different cases, but this one, above all of the other ones, is the most direct threat to our facade of democracy that we have left. And again, I'm coming at this from my perspective as a leftist, understanding how completely corrupted and dysfunctional the U.S. government is, how both parties, Democrats and Republicans, are entirely bought and controlled by corporate America, the military-industrial complex, and still it would be an absolutely horrible situation to have this play out, as it seems like it is currently on track to play out. Because again, you could have President Ron DeSantis, who was elected by a minority of the American people, where state legislatures are basically ignoring the will of the people within their states, and then you have mass uprisings, you have mass protests in response to the stealing of that election, and then you're going to have right-wing militias aided by the police and aided by a federal government under the control of Ron DeSantis. And they are going to go out and they're basically going to tear apart any semblance of democracy that we have left in this country. So, I mean, that is not an unrealistic situation. If anything, this is basically the most likely situation in terms of, assuming that the Supreme Court is going to rule on this in the way that we think that they are. This is the playbook. We have the playbook. We know exactly what they're going to try to do. This is how they're going to steal the election in 2024. And so, I go back to the January 6 hearings, and it's great to have all of this exposed and to, get into the details of exactly what happened and what was Trump's mindset and where were the criminal actions taking place and who's responsible for all of this. That's all fine and great, but number one, if you're not going to actually file charges at the end of the day, then it's basically fucking pointless. And number two, you're allowing this to happen in the background. Okay, so much focus on the January 6 hearings. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court is legalizing and making it constitutional for exactly what happened on January 6 to be done in a legal capacity. So I don't understand how there's not more focus on this, as if this is not what should be on the forefront of people's minds. And just as a reminder, in terms of these state legislatures and when Republicans and conservatives insist on respecting states' rights, this is the type of shit that they're talking about. Okay, we just had this recent Supreme Court ruling which basically allowed for a Louisiana electoral map which was massively racially gerrymandered to take effect. So clearly the Supreme Court doesn't give a single solitary shit about protecting democracy at even the most fundamental levels. But on top of that, again, we're going to have these state legislatures which are already massively gerrymandering. We're going to have those even more gerrymandered in the future and giving them unilateral authority over federal elections. And I think AOC had a good point here, basically just summarizing it. She says, "We are witnessing a judicial coup in the process. If the president and Congress do not restrain the court now, the court is signaling that they will come for the presidential election next. All of our leaders, regardless of party, must recognize this constitutional crisis for what it is. And she says, at this point, we should be well beyond partisanship. I wish that we were, not the country that we live in right now. But she says members of Congress have sworn an oath to the Constitution. Fuck the Constitution. Clearly, if you're able to just pick and choose how you're going to interpret the Constitution, we have a group of essentially God kings sitting on the Supreme Court that can pervert the Constitution up and down. Clearly, it's not something that deserves respect. And yeah, again, fuck the Constitution, fuck the Supreme Court, and fuck any single institution that is not serving the American people. But nonetheless, she says, you've sworn an oath to the Constitution. It is our duty to check the court's gross overreach of power in violating people's inalienable rights and seizing for itself the powers of Congress and the president. So she's right, but at the same time, this is not going to happen with bipartisanship, okay? That is delusional. You need to have Democrats right now aggressively pushing for a complete overhaul and reforming our election system. You need to dramatically expand access to voting. You need to dramatically limit the power of the Supreme Court for judicial review. So many different ways that you could go about doing this, and Democrats are basically just sitting around. They're doing the January 6 hearings. Okay, that's fine and good. What are you doing about this? Because you go through all the January 6 hearings all day, all night, but then if you turn around and the Supreme Court just behind your back legalized and made it constitutional for them to do exactly what they tried in 2020, in 2024, then what the fuck is the point of any of this? So again, you have to have a focus on this. And just to give you a perspective on the latest of what the Biden administration thinks of the Supreme Court, here we had from Ken Klippenstein, Biden's Health and Human Services Secretary, says, unless we're all going to say the word of the Supreme Court will no longer have value, we tend to heed the word of the Supreme Court. So this was in response to abortion rights, but obviously this is the mindset, this is the liberal mindset of respecting and glorifying our institutions that are fundamentally broken and have been broken since the inception of this country and the Constitution. They are glorifying and insisting that we respect these institutions, the sacred nature of the Supreme Court, while the Supreme Court is literally right now dismantling democracy right in front of our eyes. So again, it's a complete fucking joke, but this is another lesson in how liberals will not be the bulwark. They will never be the vanguard standing up against a fascist takeover of the country. They will be insisting on paving the pathway for that fascist takeover, and they will continue to put their blinders on and pretend as if this is not happening, and pretend as if all you need to do is vote harder. All you need to do is donate $15 to Nancy Pelosi, and then democracy will be protected for the future. It's complete and utter bullshit. You need to aggressively expand Democratic voting rights right now. You need to get that done before the midterm elections. But, you know, honestly, given the priorities of the Biden administration, given what they're saying right now, it seems like they're basically sleepwalking to a complete overhaul of our elections and a legal and constitutional fascist takeover of the United States.